with developing any kind of economy that's independent of U.S. diktats, whether it's socialism with Chinese characteristics, whether it's Bolivarian socialism like Venezuela, whether it's Cuban socialism like in Cuba, whether it's Korean socialism like in the DPRK, hell, whether if it's Russia, which does not consider itself socialist, but has a very mixed economy, that is principally capitalist. No, regardless of whichever it is, it's going to take an embrace of the fact that the country with which you live in doesn't have everything that you need to meet all of the various problems, to address all the various problems, to grow the economy, to raise standard of living. Usually, because of the way the world has been because of the way development around the world has transpired, where you had incredible amounts of unevenness. Well, why was that? Well, because the collective West attempted to. There's the picture that you often see. It's a meme. I don't know if you've seen it, JB. It's the picture where you have North America and Europe with all the pebbles, and then you have Africa, Asia, Latin America completely dug up, and all that's been dug up is in Europe, in North America. Well, that's because that's how history has moved. And that is what people in the global South have been fighting against for many centuries now.
As you seem to know quite a bit about China and their systems and policies. Now, I've heard people say that China is not a socialist country, but they say it is state capitalist. What is the more accurate description of China's economic system in your view?
Wow, now that's another question. I guess we'll go on a mini retreat too. In terms of the that's a big question. Well, when I'm from the United States, and
of course,
what I tend to try to do when I look at the social systems of other countries is I try to first learn from the language that particular country uses, because I do think that there's something incredibly condescending, if not outright racist, about hearing, for example, China call themselves socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's how the Chinese see their socialist system, and immediately say, "Oh, that's not true," right? Like, where do you even get off on initially thinking like that? Like, that sounds more like McCarthyist baggage. That sounds like Cold War, almost like we have been embedded with a Cold War type of thinking to the point where it's unconscious now. It just comes out, and we're just reacting to how the Chinese and how Chinese people and how the Communist Party of China talks about things. So I would call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. And what that means is that there's a socialist governance system and a market economy that is both regulated and directed by that socialist governance system, while it also incorporates the so-called free market. But really, all that means is it incorporates certain aspects, mechanisms of capitalist development in order to raise the productive forces to the point where the socialist governance system can meet the objectives and the directives that it has set forth to do. So, China opened up to, or supposedly, a lot of people say China opened up in 1978, but China was closed off from the world economy until 1971. So not a lot of people know that 1949 to 1971, the United States was recognizing the Republic of China, located in what was then Formosa, but now called Taiwan. That they were recognizing that government as the rightful government of China at the United Nations, and that came with a worldwide ban on technology, and it was a sanctions campaign essentially. So it wasn't until 1971 where China even had the ability to be recognized at the United Nations and develop normal relations. The People's Republic of China developed normal relations with countries around the world, and it's kind of hard to have economic relations with most countries around the world unless you have no, unless you are recognized at the United Nations as existing as the rightful government.
Yeah.
So China had to rely a lot on the socialist bloc at that time. And so it remained, even though that did help and things got better between that period in China, it still remained very poor. It was one of the poorest countries in the world in 1971. It was one of the most poor countries in the world in 1978. And it took more than a decade after opening up to the world economy to build up industry, to begin to integrate with development all across the world so that it could begin to raise the standard of living in a much more meaningful way, in a way that corresponds with the moment of history that we are in, because many Chinese people in 1978 were living like many people lived 100 150 years before that, right? Like that is what underdevelopment and what US and Western sponsorship of the century of humiliation meant to China. It meant literally living in backward conditions and conditions that were unfit for human beings. So
Of course.
China has adopted a policy that it sees as Chinese specific. So it doesn't view its socialist governance system, its government, as something it can export, and also doesn't view its economic development model as something that can just be adopted by everyone. What it says is that it is an economy that can integrate into the larger world economy, but also protect, preserve, and pursue the interests of the people that it represents, what the Communist Party of China says it represents, which is workers in China, what were the peasants in China. Now, because standard of living is higher, they don't consider themselves necessarily peasants anymore, but what rural people need and want, and what students, what all sectors of society need and desire moving forward. And for all of the challenges, both internally and externally, that China has faced, China has been able to meet a lot of goals, has been able to eradicate extreme poverty, has been able to raise standard of living, able to raise wages, able to raise people's life expectancy. All of those things have been achieved, and the quality of life, right? Like the quality of life has become higher and higher. You often hear in China, it's the largest middle class. I kind of dislike that term because China is such a diverse society. Just like many modern economies have people who are workers who work in industry, people who work in tech sector, who are more like professional classes. Like China has all of that, similar to the United States, but they all get lumped into the middle class because they're making more money now. And so that that has been a really wide-ranging goal. China has made many gains also in the environmental sphere, what it's been able to do to clean up pollution in its cities, which was a huge problem after reform and opening up, required rapid energy use, coal use, etc., in order to ensure that industry could be developed really, really, really fast. Now it's starting to, I mean, it's accelerated to the point where it's the world leader in things like renewable energy. And I think one of China's biggest accomplishments, given its political economy, given what it has set forth to do, is that in the spirit of economic integration with attention to national sovereignty, because I think that really is what socialism with Chinese characteristics is. It's attention to national sovereignty and national interests, with the idea that integration rather than domination is the ultimate goal. So that's what I think differentiates. I can't say the term state capitalist, because if it were truly state capitalist, China would be pursuing a very similar policy, foreign policy, a very similar trajectory as a lot of Western countries ended up pursuing over the course of time. Because China, you could argue, oh, well, China was in like a feudal state, was in a very backward space, and then it used capitalism to develop really rapidly. Well, if it's just capitalism, why doesn't China behave like Western countries did when they were in a similar situation? You could even argue that why doesn't it behave like India does? India is a much better comparison because India was a colonized country. The British, committed genocide, did all those things in India. Then, independence came in the mid 20th century. And since then, India has remained much poorer than China. There's a lot of talks about India replacing China. Not going to happen because a lot of India's very marginal industries rely on China's economy because China can provide the outputs and the inputs that India needs to even build what rudimentary industry it has. So India is a great comparison because the standard of living in India is lower, life expectancy is much lower, and the behavior of the Indian government, for example, look how it's behaving with Israel. Like India's government, because it has this Hindu nationalist kind of orientation,
Right.
it thinks that it has allegiance to Zionism, right? Like Zionism is its brethren, according to the government of India. Absolutely, absolutely ridiculous. Because
Yeah.
I would love to see a delegation from India go to Israel and see how welcome they really are. But nonetheless, India is a great example because India kind of has a Western mentality in a lot of ways, politically and even economically, despite its hedging with multipolarity and its attempts to, it has to have a good relationship with Russia, and it's attempting to assert some kind of sovereignty. I don't knock any of those things. I think those are conditions born out of a world situation that demanded them. But in terms of how the Indian government operates policy wise and operates domestically international, it's a great example to use because India's situation is a lot more dire than China's is, yet they came from very similar places and even gained independence at very similar times. And yet we call China state capitalist. In India, I don't know what people call India, but maybe people just say India is capitalist. But you could say India is more state capitalist because it has a powerful central government, uh, a very powerful central government, but yet it pursues incredibly neoliberal policies and policies that more match the interests of the West in many spheres, despite its, I think, what it's been forced to do, which is to hedge its bets on Russia
Yeah.
and the multipolar world in order to, in order to really survive. Because if India really truly did embrace the West full stop, it would probably be destabilized by now. So the I think that's a good way to frame where China is that
Yeah.
China, it has a socialist government and it has an economy that meets socialist directives using the tools that it can use, because it obviously can't use
Mhm.
all of them. It can't be entirely 100% capitalist, because if that were the case, standard of living in China would not rise. But it uses the tools it can to rapidly develop the productive forces, as they're called, meaning
Yeah.
that every sector of industry, of development, is built up as fast as possible so people have opportunities to make more money, to to work fulfilling jobs, to raise their standard of living, and
Yeah.
then to pool that back into the country so that new goals can be met. Because even
Yeah.
though eliminating extreme poverty is nice, it doesn't mean poverty is gone from China. Certainly, there's
Yeah.
still inequality. Certainly, there's still needs in terms of the environment that needs to be cleaned up. There's still corruption that needs to be cleaned up politically, because that's a huge campaign right now within China's government. So there's these things that are going to continue to have needs to be addressed. Like that, there are things that need to continue to be addressed, and it's only through, as China sees it, the ability to integrate and to be part of the world economy that allows it to do so. In many ways, you could say, and I say this a lot, is you could say that China really did what is probably the only thing any socialist country in the world can do to survive in this current historical moment. And that is to be part of the world economy as much as possible so that essentially you are sanctions free, like you are kind of sanction safe. You're protected from the impact of sanctions.
Yeah.
You can't be decoupled from. There's a lot of decoupling talk from the United States. You really can't be. It really can't happen. If decoupling happens, the U.S. economy goes poof.
Yeah.
And so, even though there's all these attempts to wage economic warfare on China, but a lot of them end up failing because China has it was a strategy from the very beginning that they were developing socialism, modern socialism, or attempting to build modern socialism through the existence within the existence of the world capitalist system. That's what they sought out to do, and in many ways, they've been incredibly successful, as could be seen, for example, with the Huawei Mate 60 Pro phone, for example. That phone triggered the United States immensely. They were like, how did China build this phone with all the advanced chips that we said China was not even at the stage it could develop yet? Well, it's because China has been rapidly developing its tech sector. It has been doing so with the help of other countries, including the United States, that have been able to develop their tech sector to a large degree. It's been doing so with cooperation and collaboration with US, European, Japanese, South Korean companies. And through that, through those joint ventures, through those partnerships, it's been able to become self-sufficient and learn. That's been the whole point of opening up to the world. It's not so it can be dominated by foreign direct investment. No, of course, you got to give a little to get a little. I mean, that's part of development. You're not going to be able to get everything you want all the time in any kind of form of economic cooperation in the world system that we live in. But China said, yes, we will make some concessions, we will make some sacrifices, but
Mm-hmm.
they will be paid back manyfold. And the way that China's tech has developed, the way that Chinese science, infrastructure, all of that, the way that it's developed so rapidly is kind of proof in the pudding. Like, you can't really deny it anymore. And that's why there is such a huge campaign to undermine it and hopefully destroy it, at least in the mind of the United States, is because the writing is on the wall. China is both developing into the largest economy in the world, the most advanced economy in the world, and it's doing so on its terms, socialism with Chinese characteristics, and in effect has become even more self-reliant than it's ever been, more sovereign than it's ever been, because it is integrating the world. I mean, imagine that, because it is so connected to the world economy, because no country in the world at this moment can
Yeah.
really do without China. Because
Yeah.
it's been able to achieve that, it means that it's incredibly difficult to wrap your head around decoupling or World
Yeah.
War III with China. I mean, it is almost laughable to think about, but it is being pursued because the writing's on the wall and there's really are no other options. I mean, you're not going to cooperate your way out of, you're not going to,
Yeah.
scheme and uh, hell, the CIA complains all the time that they can't get into
Mm-hmm.
China because because China understands, they understand what the deal is. I mean, the Communist Party of China is very disciplined. It's very
Yeah.
organized,
They know
and
what
the
time it
government
is.
is very disciplined, very organized. They know. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's a reason why there's a great firewall. People always criticize me. Oh, Daniel, what about the information? It's, well, most countries in the world should probably have the things that China has. If a lot of countries that are facing, hell, I was just in Vietnam. I'll say it. I think Vietnam should have a great firewall, because when I was seeing the media that's getting into Vietnam, I'm like, wow, this could be a real problem. And I talked to people and they said, oh, it's kind of a problem because you can, through information, we've seen it everywhere. We've seen it happen in Cuba. We've seen
Mm-hmm.
it happen in countries all over the world. The color revolutions that we see, rise up in various countries that are walking maybe a slightly different, if not a very different path from U.S. diktats.
Mm-hmm.
Information warfare happens to be one of the biggest areas of of targeting these countries. It's a big
Oh, yeah.
focus. The United States is, I think, investing 500 million in Chinese, like, anti-China smear campaigns at this point, like through the Department of State. Like that is how deep it is to try to galvanize public opinion, whether within a country or around it, against
Yeah.
the so-called adversary. And so China understood that and said, okay, well, if we're going to open up to the world, if we're going to have an economy that is connected to the United States, to Europe, well, it looks like we're going to have to protect information, both in part because of the threat of what certain ideas. I mean, honestly, China can't really block ideas, and they really haven't blocked the ideas. People can get VPNs, all that stuff. It was actually more about, well, we don't want big private media, private big tech consuming our our country, because if that were to happen, well, how could we build our own? Because that's a big part of the Chinese economy at this point. I mean, the Chinese economy runs on its own apps. If I've been there twice now, and I have bared witness to how ridiculously complex it is to be someone traveling from abroad to China and trying to get things done without having an understanding of these apps. Like now I'm lucky I'm on WeChat, but even to pay for things, to get cabs, things like that, like you've got to be on many different apps. And these apps are huge. They're very popular. Most people, for example, people are not really that interested in watching YouTube because they can watch Bilibili in China. They're not really interested in a whole lot of social media platforms because they have WeChat, and WeChat is basically like a one-stop shop for most social media. So, TikTok, they don't want the Western version of TikTok. They have Douyin. So they don't need, they're like, we don't need that. We have our own. And so I think that is what really angers a lot of people in the West about China. It's why labels like state capitalist come up. It's really just a way, for, in my opinion, to just undermine the Chinese position. And for me, I think if we're going to be astute analysts of the world situation, well, we're going to have to, especially from the West, we have to soberly look at how does China talk about themselves, how does Russia, how do these countries talk about themselves,
Yeah.
and understand it as it's not perfect. I mean, certainly there are issues with the Great Firewall. There are issues with all the things that I'm discussing. But if we don't understand it and we don't respect it and you say, hey, that's their process that both has benefits and probably has drawbacks, but that's for them to figure out, then we can't be prepared to defend China and by extension ourselves from the propaganda war that we are constantly being bombarded with when it comes to China or any other country that the United States is looking to weaken, contain, overthrow, etc.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about in regards to the whole China state capitalist versus actually China is socialist with Chinese characteristics is I look at socialism like chicken. And stay with me here.
I love it because I love chicken.
Okay, me too. So if you take chicken and you ground it up and you put it into a patty and then make it into a chicken burger, is it any less chicken than a chicken breast?
Nope.
If I make chicken cacciatore, is it any less chicken than a chicken breast?
If it's not my favorite, but
but it's like if I make chicken meatballs, is it any less than a chicken breast? If I make kung pao chicken, is it any less than just a chicken breast? And so if I make chicken shish kebabs, is it any less? The thing is that is at its core, it's still exactly what socialism is, which is workers owning the means of production and workers dictating how the system operates instead of it being ran by a small cabal of billionaires and elites at the top. So that is basically what it is. So if China is operating at the with workers at the helm and dictating how the government is operating, and then they own the means of production. Essentially, they're socialists, and they're using elements of the free market in order to push themselves out of socialism. And it's no less different than those of us who are socialists in a capitalist nation where we actually have to participate in the system that we are in. Like, for instance, China is literally in a socialist country in a capitalist world. So therefore, they have to operate within that capitalist world in order to, essentially wean themselves off of it. And so I kind of look at it like, kind of like being addicted to a drug, where sometimes you may have to get a little bit of that drug just to keep you stable for a second until you wean yourself off of it. So that's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, and China learned a lot from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was, the Cold War was a much different period, and the Soviet Union attempted for so long to, and for its part, a lot of the reason for this was because it was being isolated economically and diplomatically from the West, from the collective West, mainly the United States. And so it had to, and at some points chose to basically try to socialize everything and keep everything socialized. And that, Michael Parenti talks a lot about this in his work, that had its challenges and its problems, because socialize everything, you try to get the government, the party to do everything. Well, you end up not doing a lot of things because it's hard and difficult to make decisions economically about every single set. It just goes to show that it's hard to imagine what it's like to be in the position to finally collectively determine how an economy is going to work for an entire, the Soviet Union, just like China, is really a nation of nations, right? Like, it's the Soviet Union is many republics. China is 50 plus ethnic groups. Its country is, if you go from north to south, east to west, vastly different. So if you're going to try, as China did try, with many different challenges. The Cultural Revolution was a huge challenge for China that still to this day is hotly debated, and thus not really talked about that much, because people see it as a time that had many problems to it. Even something like the Great Leap Forward, which all of the anti-communists love to bring up. Oh, they starved everyone. Well, not exactly. China tried to literally leap ahead of a socialist stage of development, meaning it was going to, in a very poor situation, like literally having very little to work with, collectivize everything and do it really, really, really fast, and try to advance the condition of the countryside as fast as possible. It led to problems, and people did get hurt by it. But people chose to do that because, well, if you lived in the countryside in 1949, 1950, 1951 China, you'd probably want to move really fast out of that situation too, because people were living on literally nothing. The conditions after the revolution were that people were hungry, people were starving, people didn't have much to eat, people didn't have money, people didn't, people didn't have potable water, these kind of things. Like, this, the very dire situation. So all that is to say is that with developing any kind of economy that's independent of U.S. diktats, whether it's socialism with Chinese characteristics, whether it's Bolivarian socialism like Venezuela, whether it's Cuban socialism like in Cuba, whether it's Korean socialism like in the DPRK, hell, whether if it's Russia, which does not consider itself socialist, but has a very mixed economy, that is principally capitalist. No, regardless of whichever it is, it's going to take an embrace of the fact that the country with which you live in doesn't have everything that you need to meet all of the various problems, to address all the various problems, to
Hmm.
grow the economy, to raise standard of living, usually because of the way the world has been um, because of the way development around the world has transpired, where you had incredible amounts of unevenness. Well, why was that? Well, because the collective West attempted to. There's the picture that you often see. It's a meme. I don't know if you've seen it, JB. It's the picture where you have North America and Europe with all the pebbles, and then you have Africa, Asia, Latin America completely dug up, and
Yep.
all that's been dug up is in Europe, in North America. Well, that's because that's how history has moved, and
Yep.
that is what people in the global South have been fighting against for many centuries now. And so that reality still dictates. I mean, hell, you have Russia talking today about, they say colonialism all the time. Right? Putin is talking, calling the West colonialist. Russia
Hmm.
is, calling NATO colonialist, and it's because they view the attack on them as an attempt to subordinate Russia back into a colonial position or a semi-colonial position. And
Hmm.
so the reality of the world still operates in that framework, the legacies of that, hell, even the social relations that most
Yeah.
countries have to enter into with the United States and West are dictated by a colonial or a neo-colonial situation, regardless of the politics of that particular country. And people like to think about China as being so all powerful that it's, you have these, I mean, you have some really whacked out people, for example, on the far
Yeah.
right, who literally think China controls like Wall Street and the Democratic Party, like the Matt Stollers, for example. They think China is dominating Wall Street. Never ever probably looked at a joint venture that China has had to enter to with any U.S. corporation. You can bet your ass that still most of the profits are going to that U.S. company. Why? Because that U.S. company is not going to do business unless you operate on some of its terms. And so China said, okay, well, we have certain currency arrangement. We have the ability to, for what we do get, we can distribute that in a certain way. But it does take, like, it takes, it's still based on a relationship not dictated entirely or wholly by China.
Hmm.
China does everything it can. There are rules and laws, but unfortunately, the U.S. and Europe don't really like to follow rules and laws. So there are a lot of, I guess, legacies and things that we have to take into account when we look at how countries can develop out of Western domination in
Yeah.
a world that is still, despite the decline, despite the chaos, despite the crisis that the United States and the West finds itself in,
Yeah.
still the vast majority of wealth, the vast majority of the means of production, we could say globally, still rest in the collective West because, well, maybe not the means of production, because really the global South builds everything now, but the control, the financing, the financial instruments, and also the military hardware to defend the wealth that the collective West has
Hmm.
usurped from the rest. That still resides in the United States and Europe. And so even countries like China, still underdeveloped, still trying to shake out fair deals.
Yeah.
It's not easy. It's easier now because China has way more leverage, but
Yeah.
it wasn't easy in the beginning. That's why you had issues with, for example, the Taiwan-based Foxconn company, where there
Hmm.
were poor working conditions. Hell, China's sued them many times to try to improve working conditions, tried to do many things to improve that situation, and has in many ways, at least in terms of money earned for workers. But at the same time, it's hard to change and to force a system and the corporations that represent that system to do something differently without them saying, well, you're eating to my profits. Sorry, goodbye. And so that
Hmm.
means, despite the sovereignty, despite the ability of China it has a political system that is independent, is not dictated by the West. It's not dictating Wall Street either, which is a hilarious thing that comes out of certain elements of the far right in the West. But regardless, despite all of those strengths and advantages, China, Russia, and especially the smaller countries, Cuba. Look at the sanctions on Cuba. I mean, Cuba cannot. I've been to Cuba. I've seen what those sanctions have done. Cuba can't get certain resources, can't get certain very, very rudimentary raw materials, like concrete, for example, costs an enormous amount of money to export to Cuba because of the way the blockade is designed. And so you see in Cuba, Havana is the most developed city. You'll see paint chipping. You'll see, sidewalks cracking, things like that, because they can't get the concrete needed to fix and repair those things. So that's the situation that many countries trying to chart their own path face, whether they're socialist or whether they view themselves as otherwise, doesn't matter. They end up being targeted. Iran, for example, probably wouldn't call itself socialist, but it has an economy that is under incredible strangulation sanctions from the United States. And because of that, well, it's made many achievements. I mean, there's a reason why you don't hear much about Iran. It's because despite those sanctions, Iran has been able to develop quite nicely, at least internally. Even so, it is not going to be able, unless it subordinates itself to the United States, unless it says, okay, we're going to do everything you want, we'll destabilize ourselves, we'll be your little unsinkable aircraft carrier in West Asia. Unless you do that, you're going to be under the gun. And so that's the challenge. And so Iran, of course, sanctioned countries want to be integrated in the world. They don't want to be isolated from the United States or anyone else, because opportunities to trade, to economically develop relations with even the West means that it can bring benefits to your country, as long as you have the sovereignty to ensure that those relations don't turn completely uneven and upside down, where you have the United States and the West sitting on your neck. So while it is a delicate dance, I think China is a good example of what it looks like to dance in a manner that's very skilled and disciplined and has brought a lot of achievements. And while it doesn't have, there aren't stumbles along the way, and it's not always perfect choreography. There is, I think there's a lot to be learned from that, especially for those who don't know how to dance. For example, like the majority of people in governments in the West, they don't know how to do this. And the reason why is because they reside in the countries that are the perpetual problem, that are blocking this kind of development and this kind of future for the world.
Boy, they ain't got no rhythm either.